Parshas Mishpatim. Parshas Mishpatim obviously is a paradise for people who spend time in yeshiva, carefully studying and luxuriating over the halachos of Dini Choshe Mishpat, Dini Mamnus, Kinyanim, Geneva, Shomrim, Avadim. But for people that aren't deeply embedded in that world, it can feel a little bit dry and technical. So it's a very, polarizing, but it levels or it divides. Some people can't wait for Mishpatim, some people can't wait to get out of Mishpatim. So to shake things up a little bit, because there's very little narrative, there's a narrative towards the end of the Parsha about Har Sinai, the second Har Sinai. I want to discuss something completely and totally unrelated to the Parsha, but I think important to think about, not just historiographically how Svarim were written and why Svarim were written, but about the evolution of halakha and how we see halakha in our day and age, in our stage of Jewish history. So, why am I speaking about it on Parshas Mishpatim? Elai Mishpatim asher tasim lifnehem, and this is effectively the beginning of the delivery of the Torah to Moshe Rabbeinu, the Masara to Moshe Rabbeinu, and of course HaKadosh Baruch Hu chooses moral laws, social customs to first deliver to Moshe Rabbeinu, how to build a society. Torah is not just delivered to individuals, it's meant to be a recipe for a stable, ethical, moral, and functioning society. And Parshas Mishpatim creates that financial, economic, or commercial backbone for a properly functioning and efficient and morally sensitive society. But when HaKadosh Baruch Hu delivers these halachos, and he instructs Moshe asher tasim lifnehem, and this language tasim lifnehem, which is extraneous, normally Vaydaber Hashem l'Moshe lemar debel b'nei Yisrael amor b'nei Yisrael asher tasim lifnehem, incites the very well-known Chazal that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was instructing Moshe to be clear, to be cogent, to be articulate, to be organized, to make things easy. To all the aspiring Rabbanim out there, and pedagogues, and of course myself as well, and anyone who teaches Torah, you should probably spend at least as much time preparing how to say something as much as you prepare or spend time as to what to say. It's too often we spend so much time gathering information and collecting information, and we're not prepared to deliver it, and so much of our Torah is blocked, is inaccessible, because it lacks clarity. So Asher Tasim Lifnehem, HaKadosh Baruch Hu was encouraging Moshe Rabbeinu to organize it clearly, to convey it clearly, to work at his pedagogy skills. And of course it's true about Mishpatim, because Mishpatim could be very complicated, and the halachos of Nezikin could be complicated, but of course Mishpatim is not just the Parsha of Choshe Mishpat, but it's the introduction, or it's the first moment in which Moshe is delivering a massive halacha, so it's not just referring to Mishpatim. Rashi develops a metaphor to convey clarity and organization. Whether Hashem used this metaphor to Moshe, or Rashi saying Hashem urged Moshe to reach this level of clarity and organization and lucidity, Shulchan Arukh. It should be as clear and organized and structured as a table that is set. Now, the Shulchan Arukh can mean one of two things, and of course it means both. It can mean a table that's set for people to eat, for people to join the meal. We set the table, we organize the table. Cutlery belongs in one place, food belongs in a different place, napkins belong in a third place, where people sit. Of course, in certain cultures, it was more formalized, who sits where. In our culture, it's less formalized, but just show up and eat. There's expectations, there's mores, there's a normative way to eat, table manners. And it could also be referring not just to the Shulchan that I set for my family, but to the Shulchan in the Beis HaMikdash, which, because it was a Shulchan, it was meant to mimic a human meal, was highly structured and organized with long plates and rods and symmetry. And so the Shulchan, whether it's the Shulchan in our home or the Shulchan in the Beis HaMikdash or the Mishkan, was the paradigm, or the epitome of organization and structure. And in many ways, it stood as a foil or as a contrast to the menorah, which was a epitome or a paradigm of aesthetic and beauty and lack of functionality. Most of the menorah had little function. The kaftorim had no function. The gevim had no function. The prachim had no function. The yarech had little function. The legs underneath the yarech had little function. The kini hamenorah, if you wanted to create light, you would just create one big bonfire, or as some of the Rishonim say, based on the Gemara's Havamim and Menachos, one straight flat row in which you place candles. but our purpose is not just functional to facilitate light or lighting in the Beis HaMikdash, but aesthetic and beauty and yofi. As the Ramban writes in Parshas Ba'aloscha, it is the epitome of Hidor in the Makam Hashem, and it's a reminder that art and beauty does play a role within religious consciousness, even though in so many cases in the modern world, people feel that it's foreign and threatening to piety and religious consciousness. So the Shulchan is the paradigm of structure or organization, the Menorah is the paradigm of aesthetics and beauty. They stand against each other, they're poised against one another, positioned against one another to create that balance. But when HaKadosh Baruch Hu encourages Moshe to be clear and organized, which this year is not, because I've been taking a lot of sidebars, he encourages Moshe to deliver the Torah to Am Yisrael like a Shulchan Arukh. So fast forward a couple hundred years after Rashi, it's really quoting the Medrash, Rashi quotes this metaphor in the 11th century in France, and now we are in the 16th century in, not Spain, but what's called Turkey and Israel. And Rabbi Yosef Cairo, who was born in Spain in 1488, was expelled with the other Jews in 1492, and was then expelled from Portugal again a couple years later, made his way to Turkey, ultimately settled in Tzfat, decides to revolutionize the halachic system. What I mean revolutionize the halachic system is as follows. We are accustomed, because we were born into a world of halachic standardization and halachic homogenization, which is one halakha by and large. Obviously, there are tributary differences based on questions that weren't discussed by the Shulchan Aruch, newfound developments, issues where we may disagree with the Shulchan Aruch, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but we follow the Shulchan Aruch. Before the Shulchan Aruch was written, halakha was much more pluralistic and flexible and elastic. You live in France in one city, you made Kiddush one way, based on your Rav's psak. Let's say you lived in the Rebbeinu Tam city. If you lived in the Ravid city, you made Kiddush a different way. If you lived in Spain, you lived under the inspiration and the authority of the Ramban and his Talmidim, you made Kiddush a third way. What people don't always understand about Gemara is that the plethora of opinions and the disputes are not representative. They don't reflect the breakdown of a Marsara and the breakdown of one truth that was given in Har Sinai. At Har Sinai, Hashem told Moshe this could be Tameh, and there are 49 different ways to prove that his sheretz, let's say, would be Tameh. And then he turned it around and said it's also Tahor, and there are 49 different ways for it to be Tahor. And in Hashem's mind, because Hashem isn't binary, they can both be true, because Hashem does not operate in absolute true and false. Human beings are binary. For us, it's day or night, true or false, good or evil, on or off. For HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Yotzer Or V'Ari Choshech, Oseh Shalom U'Vari Sakol, and each position in Shas is part of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Ratzon, and therefore we study every single Shita and every single Havamina. A lot of people who are outsiders to the halachic or Talmudic process don't fully grasp this and sometimes trivialize learning Gemara. You're meandering your way through so much dross and chas v'shalom and chaff and wasted, discarded, till you get to the psak. Just learn what the psak is, and the answer is there is no one truth. As Niels Bohr, the Rebbe of Oppenheimer in physics, said, the opposite of a true statement is a false statement. The opposite of a profound statement is another profound statement. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu deals in profundities, not in true or false. So in Shas, there are multiple positions. Now, in the world of action, halachic practice, you can't make Kiddush twice. You can take two lulavim, but there has to be one, because the world of human action is binary. So there has to be only one way and one approach, and before the Shulchan Aruch was written, it was up to each particular posek and each particular Rav to decide which approach to implement. And as I said before, there's a lot of elasticity and a lot of pluralism and a lot of differentiation, reflecting that, of course, each one person, each one community had only one way of practicing halakha. But the world of practice reflected the elasticity and the diversity of the world of Gemara. Namely, there was less of a split between the Gemara, in which every single position represents partial truth of Hashem, and the world of halacha, in which many of those different positions. Obviously, when the Gemara paskins in a certain way, then we follow that psak, but the Gemara doesn't address every issue, and issues that were spun off from the Gemara's psak allowed differences of opinion and encouraged differences of opinion. Now it's the 15th and 16th century, and Rabbi Yosef Cairo makes a bold decision. And his decision is to standardize halakha and create a system for standardizing halakha. And he writes the Sefer Beis Yosef, and he begins in the 1520s and takes about 30 years to write, so it's finished in the 1550s. and he creates a system. And the system is he takes the three greatest authorities of the past 200-300 years, of the medieval period, of the 11th, 12th century, 13th century, which is, of course, the Rif, the Rambam, and the Rush. And he says that he will paskin based on a majority of opinion. So if it's a unanimous position, 3-0, then the psak is obvious. But if there's a machlokas between what the Rif, the Rambam, and the Rush said, then he'll follow a 2-1 majority. And he tries to standardize and homogenize halakha. Now, why he took this decision is because there were two very, very destabilizing events of the 15th century that threatened the integrity of halakha and halachic practice. One is obvious, the Spanish Inquisition, and hundreds of thousands of Jews are now migrating throughout the world. They're migrating to Western Europe, other parts of Western Europe. They're migrating to Eastern Europe. They're migrating to the Balkans and the Mediterranean basin, to Greece and Turkey, and ultimately Israel, to Arabic lands where they Sephardicize Arab Jews. Arab Jews are not Sephardic. They're Arab Jews with their own customs, but they get overwhelmed by these rich, bright, influential Spaniards who bring the Masara of Sfarad, of the Rambam, of the Ramban, and the Talmidim of the Ramban in particular. And of course, some of them migrating to African countries. And there's a lot of clashing and disagreements. All these Spaniards are walking into shuls in France or Amsterdam, and not yet Amsterdam, but walking into France and walking, and they're bringing their masoras, and they're having big machloksim with the locals about what halachic practice to perform. And just in general, the migration and the movement and the immigration is very destabilizing, because halakha, as you know, is not just out of a book, especially before there were that many books, but it's mimetic, as Reb Chaim Soloveitchik so eloquently pointed out. You see how your parents behaved. What happens if you lost your parents? Or what happens if you were forced to live with other people other than your parents because of the migration? Or what happens if you were not in a home for 2-3 years because you were traveling from Spain to Israel and you were in the forests and the woods, and halachic practice was chiseled away at or was diminished? So he felt that allowing halakha to be pluralized and to be elasticized and for diversity would not create a durable halakha commitment. And the second issue, which is less appreciated, is the invention of the printing press. Johann Gutenberg, 1440, 1450, 15th century. Obviously, these inventions take a while to make their way to the broader world. With printing presses, you can print a greater volume of Torah works. It used to be that printing Torah works was hard manual labor, and it took a lot of financial subsidies to print svarim, and because it was so expensive and so laborious and required so much labor. And because of that, there was a self-selecting process, self-filtering process, that only the top svarim that had gone through the reviews and the vetting, as we would say, were printed. Now, with the printing press, every Tom, Dick, and Harry can print a sefer, and like anything else, the increase in svarim and the inflation of svarim leads to the devaluation of each sefer, because you don't know the difference between an authoritative work that should be followed or just some person down the road who got his hands on a printing press and printed out his Torah. So it's very difficult to make your way through this muck and this mess and this chaos of different works being printed. So the Yosef Karo says, I'm going to standardize it. I'm going to call my sefer Beis Yosef, out of the Psukim and Parshas Miketz and Vayigash, the house of Yosef. Yosef supported an entire world. I'm going to support an entire world of halachic practitioners. And at the end of his life, he realizes that that sefer is too ambitious and it's too hard for people to understand and to read the Beis Yosef. So he writes cliff notes. Monarch notes, I don't know what you use, but summaries, easy little summaries to make it more accessible to the common person. And he chooses the image of Rashi in Parshas Mishpatim. He calls his summary of his great magnum opus, he calls that summary Shulchan Arukh, because it's more accessible, it's greater ease, and it's organized even more than the Beis Yosef. And of course, the Ramah, Moshe Isserles, who is living in Poland at the time, who was also preparing his own sefer, decides that for the sake of halachic stability, he's not going to publish his own sefer, he's just going to publish his addendums and his corrections or his statements and the comments of the Shulchan Aruch, and he calls it the Mappa, and the Mappa is HaShulchan, which is going to be a tablecloth for the Shulchan, one of the great heroic acts of Jewish academic or Jewish scholarship. And for Rabbi Yosef Kairo's Shulchan Aruch, as Rashi quoted it, as Kadosh Baruch Hu, as the Medrash suggests, becomes the epitome or the exemplar of something organized and easy and accessible. Now, what happens? In the initial couple centuries, or initial couple decades, it's not clear whether everyone agrees with Rabbi Yosef Kairo's strategy. He has many opponents, And his most strident, well-known opponent is the Maharshal of Shlomo Luria, who's living in Lublin. And his basic opposition is twofold. It's a technical or ethnic opposition, as well as a fundamental or ideological opposition. His technical opposition is that Rabbi Yosef Karo stacked the deck. It's one thing to talk about universality of halakha, and we'll get the best and the brightest, but two of the people on Rabbi Yosef Kairo's panel were Sephardim, the Rif and the Rambam. And the third one, the Rush, was a tweener, because he began his life in Germany, France, but had to flee in the wake of the Maharami Rothenburg situation, and he lands in Spain, where the Rashba greets him, and he becomes a Rav in Toledo, in Spain. So he's one of the only Rishonim that has both sides to him. So the Maharshal believes that Rabbi Yosef Kairo's ideal or idea may be correct, but it's too stacked towards Sephardic halakha. But his other opposition is that you're creating a rift between the world of Psak and the world of Gemara. And just like the world of Gemara lends itself to multiple options, many different approaches, pluralism, similarly halakha should follow, and each Rav should study the sugya and come up with their own Psak. So there's a lot of disagreement, and he writes, not diatribes, but polemics, intellectual-based oppositions to the Shulchan Aruch. What happens is what always happens, and this is fascinating about our people and our halachic authority, is that ultimately Judaism is very democratic, and the final decisions lie with the people who vote with their feet. What made Rabbi Nasi's Mishnah accepted? Was there a Baskol that came out and said everyone should accept this decision? No, it's Am Yisrael, because he was clearly the biggest Talmid Chacham of his generation, and because he had political influence, Torah וכדו b'makom echad, people accepted his word. It was unanimous, but people fell in line, and that lent credibility and authority to the Mishnah. And a couple centuries later, to Ravina Rav Ashi, it was again less revolutionary, less groundbreaking, because they had already broken through that barrier, broken through that glass ceiling, but it was the same story. And the same thing happened in the 16th and 17th century as the Shulchan Aruch became more accepted, essentially became the gold standard, and Rabbi Yosef Kairo's decision became the baseline of halacha. And today, the halacha conversation has to begin with the Shulchan Aruch. It doesn't always end with the Shulchan Aruch for many reasons. Sometimes it doesn't end with the Shulchan Aruch because there are issues he didn't discuss. Sometimes it doesn't end with the Shulchan Aruch because there are new ideas that evolve with technology and progress. Sometimes it doesn't end with the Shulchan Aruch because it's vague what he thought. Sometimes it doesn't end with the Shulchan Aruch because it's clear what he thought about an issue that was relevant in his day, but our Masara became not to hold like the Shulchan Aruch in this area, and those Masaras are very different. What's your Masara if you're a Talmud of Rabbi Soloveitchik? What's your Masara if you're a Talmud of Lakewood? What's your Masara if you're a Hasidic Welt? Very, very different, but it's clear that in this case we follow the Shach, in this case we follow the Taz, and that's why you really need to adopt a Masara. You can't just learn straight from the Shulchan Aruch or the Mishnah Berurah. Decides not to pass the Shulchan Aruch in this context. But the conversation starts with the Shulchan Aruch. And leapfrogging the Shulchan Aruch and going back in history and saying, well, he paskel like this shita, but I found a different Rishon that held differently, it's very, very thin ice. It's very shaky ground. A couple of years ago, there was a story that happened in high school in North America, and I want to talk about this as sensitively as I can because there's a lot of politics and ideology and arguments, but I wanted to cut to the core of the issue, in which a young lady, a woman, I think she was a young girl, a teenage girl in high school, chose to put on tefillin. And there was a lot, and she received the partial sanction of her school. And of course, this issue became a magnet, a lightning rod for feminism and the relationship between feminism and religion, and a lot of interesting, important conversations. But the core issue there was as follows. Throughout history, most women did not put on tefillin. It's a mitzvah shezman grama, and for all sorts of reasons, it's not a mitzvah shezman grama, which we encourage women to perform. But there were individuals who chose to put on tefillin, and these are recorded and documented. But that all happens before the 16th century, before 1553. In 1553, Rabbi Yosef Karo makes a decision, and he clocks in with the position that women should not wear tefillin. And halachic logic says that that becomes the gold standard, and then we begin, of course, if great people line up and say we don't hold like the Shulchan Aruch in a particular context, and people accept that, then this is everything else. Am Yisrael has the final word, the final say. If there's something the Shulchan Aruch left ambiguous or something he didn't discuss, but here it's pretty black and white. And the second that you allow leapfrogging the Shulchan Aruch and going back in history and snatching an opinion, in this case women wearing tefillin, you're starting to destabilize the stabilization of halakha which the Shulchan Aruch conferred. And you could do that for a chumrah because it's clear that everyone has the personal prerogative to take a chumrah. So even though the Shulchan Aruch is mekil, I found the shita in the Rambam, or I found the shita in the Rosh, or I found the shita in the Tosas Rid, and therefore on a personal level I'm going to be annoying that chumrah. Like every chumrah is a way to personalize halakha. Not everyone keeps it, but I keep it. And unfortunately, chumrah is becoming too diluted because the second a gadol adopts a chumrah, it becomes the clear halakha that everyone must follow, and we're losing. We are creating too much. There's an inflation of chumras, which is again devaluing the purpose and impact of a chumrah. But that's for a different conversation entirely. But to be mekil, which essentially is pulling the rug out from under the Shulchan Aruch, and not saying, oh, I'm going to be machmir in addition to the Shulchan Aruch's psak, but I'm going to disagree with the Shulchan Aruch who said, in this case, women don't wear tefillin. And it's not heresy, it's not anti-halacha, but you're so poskening like a rishon, or you're adopting a different position in that world of Talmudic logic and positions, but it's not how halacha has evolved. Halacha has evolved in the 21st century that the Shulchan Aruch becomes the baseline. So if someone doesn't keep the Shulchan Aruch, don't call him non-halachic. Assuming he's keeping some other shita. That's wrong, and that's too powerful a statement. But right now, our masara is we follow the Shulchan Aruch as our psak. And that's the difference between living in the 21st century or the 18th century and living in the 12th century or the 6th century. So there's a lot to talk about, but just when you read that Rashi, Shulchan Aruch Lefanav, think about the composition of the Beis Yosef, which then becomes the Shulchan Aruch, and if you want to follow it even more, then the Aruch HaShulchan in the 19th century, the great defender of Eastern European minhagim, even when they disagree with Shulchan Aruch. So it's not incidental that the Aruch HaShulchan is the inversion of the Shulchan Aruch, Shulchan Aruch, Aruch HaShulchan, because he finds ways to justify positions which are errant with the Shulchan Aruch, which are deviant from the Shulchan Aruch, because he's a great supporter of minhag. Of course, he works within halachic logic. But two things to take away. Well, first of all, it's just interesting, the historiography of how the Shulchan Aruch was written. But ultimately, Am Yisrael creates, it's a very democratic system, Lo B'Shamayim Hi, which is the pasuk and the story of the Tana Shalachnai, Achrei Rab Lahatos. Torah was given to us, and we create the psak halacha, and we create a psak halacha throughout history, and sometimes it becomes more institutionalized and formalized. So Shulchan Aruch created psak halacha not because he opposed whatever shita other people were saying, and we were like the Shulchan Aruch, because he wrote a sefer which was universally accepted after a couple of decades, and people started to write svarim about that sefer for about 150 years. All the great minds of Am Yisrael wrote svarim about the Shulchan Aruch, even the Shach and the Taz. Much of their svarim and their conversations are about Shas, but their starting point is the Shulchan Aruch, Sifkatan in the Shulchan Aruch. So that lent greater oomph and greater validity and greater authority to the Shulchan Aruch. And now that we're in a post-Shulchan Aruch world, Am Yisrael, having accepted the Shulchan Aruch, certifies the Shulchan Aruch as the gold standard, unless we have a masara of great people throughout centuries or decades who disagreed with the Shulchan Aruch, and Am Yisrael accepted their disagreement, or of course areas the Shulchan Aruch didn't address.